Imagine the city you live in. Imagine the tall skyscrapers with all its windows. Imagine the houses next to it. Imagine even a chimney, and there's a fire going because it's cold outside. Imagine the road outside with cars passing by. When you think of life in this bustling city, what do you think of? You think of the trees probably around you, of the people walking by, and even the cute dogs and cats. You think of the birds flying around. When you think of this life that's bustling around you, think of how complex it is. Think of how it can interact with each other. Think of how it can survive in the harshest of conditions. This is the life as we know it, as we understand it. However, there's also another kind of life. This is the second kind of life we'll talk about. To look at this life, we have to zoom in. We have to zoom in because these are tiny. These are the bacteria that live inside us and on top of us, on the tables we eat on and on the roads we walk on. They are everywhere and they play a really important role in the basic biochemistry of this earth. However, they're also simple. They're single celled, and the way they interact with their environment is just a lot simpler than the life we're used to. So, then, if we were to divide life on Earth into two parts, the first would be humans like us and the animals around us and the trees and snakes. These are complex life that can do lots of really interesting things like thinking and making social groups. They're all made of cells called eukaryotes. All these cells have a special room inside of them where all their DNA lives. It's called the nucleus. On the other side, the simpler, smaller, single-celled stuff called bacteria and archaea are all called prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. So the question that I ask as a scientist is, why are these two entities so different? What makes eukaryotes able to form these really big multicellular interesting stuff like human beings or cats and dogs and trees? And why can't bacteria come together to do these things? Why can eukaryotes be so complex while prokaryotes cannot? Is there a special ingredient to eukaryotes that's not in prokaryotes? One way to get at this question is to go back in time to when eukaryotes first emerged. Maybe that could give us an answer as to why they're different. So let's suppose we could build a time machine. It's not realistic, but let's consider it. Suppose we were able to go back in time to, say, a few hundreds of thousands, if not a million, 2 million years ago, when we looked a bit more like apes. We're still eukaryotes. So let's still go back a bit more. Maybe a few 100 million years ago, when we looked like animals you couldn't recognize today. Still not relevant. We go back hundreds of millions of years ago when we were fish swimming around in the ocean. We're still eukaryotes. Let's push all the way back to 3 4 billion years ago when we looked like bacteria. That's the stage we're interested in. So let's say we're somehow able to build this really cool time machine and we're able to go back to early Earth when the storms are different and the mountains are different and the continents look different. And suppose we're in this stage at the very beginning when everything around us, when all life is just bacteria. As time went on, something happened. Something happened which is this big black box that we just don't understand. After that happened, we became eukaryotes. We became multicellular things that could do things as a group. We became human beings. Now, unfortunately, we don't have much to go on as to this big black box and what happened to make eukaryotes what they are. But we do have one or two leads. Consider a eukaryotic cell. At its very center is a nucleus where all the DNA lives. It is clearly very important to the eukaryote because prokaryotes don't have it. But what other things do eukaryotes have that prokaryotes don't? There's the nucleus, of course, but there's also the mitochondrion. You might have heard of the mitochondrion. It's called the powerhouse of the cell. It makes all the energy for eukaryotes, and prokaryotes don't have this. But all eukaryotes have, or have at some point had, a mitochondrion. So, in order to get at the question of where eukaryotes came from, we can ask, how did the mitochondrion arise? Since we have absolutely zero leads as to the origin of the nucleus, the mitochondrion could give us some clue as to how the eukaryote arose. And because of a lot of research, we actually do have some idea. Billions of years ago on early Earth, there was a prokaryote that belonged to the group Archaea. Remember, eukaryotes did not exist back then. Looking for food, it found another prokaryote that belonged to the group Bacteria. The archaeum engulfed the bacterium, but instead of what was going to be a bad relationship, it turned into a symbiosis, a collaboration. The bacterium provided energy to the archaeum, while the archaeum gave food to the bacterium. That bacterium has today become the mitochondria in all our cells, and that archaeum has become the eukaryotes that we are today. Since then, the nucleus has somehow emerged, and we don't understand why. However, because we have a clue as to how the mitochondrion emerged, we can use that to understand how the eukaryote and the nucleus could have evolved. As an experimental scientist, that is exactly what I do in lab. I take tubes of archaea and tubes of bacteria and I evolve and engineer them to grow together and become symbiotic. Then I try and put the bacteria inside the archaea and use creative engineering and evolution solutions to create an environment where the bacterium starts to act like the mitochondrion. Over time, with the right evolutionary pressures, maybe, just maybe, we could eventually evolve what looks like a nucleus and what could be an early eukaryote. This could give us insights to not only how the eukaryote evolved on early Earth, but also how archaea and bacteria interact with each other and how it can lead to really interesting innovations. Now, at this point, I'd like to take a quick break from what we were talking about in terms of real science and talk more about the nature of science. Oftentimes, as scientists, when we're trying to solve a problem, the route from the question to the actual answer is not always simple. Sometimes it can be a direct, simple lead. Other times, the road can be long winding and not often straightforward. For instance, solving cancer can be either finding drugs that help cure the symptoms or finding the gene responsible for cancer. With our problem, though, there's a more fundamental issue. It's time. It happened 3 4 billion years ago. So, all the routes that are available for other traditional problems are not available to us. Instead, the only real way in which we can try and get at the answer is to try and recreate the event in some feasible way inside the lab, like I talked to you about. Because the likelihood of finding a fossil of the exact time in which the eukaryote was formed is next to zero. Now, the other part of doing this kind of work is why? Why are we even trying to understand how eukaryotes emerged? Personally, for me, the answer is curiosity. As human beings, we're fascinated about where we come from. It keeps me up at night thinking about that dark, stormy night 3 or 4 billion years ago when eukaryotes first emerged, fundamentally changing the course, helping you and I to come alive and live. The second is thinking about all the planets out there. There has to be one or two or multiple planets where life is sustained. If we understand how life evolved on early Earth and the conditions that allowed it to exist in the way it is, maybe it'll help us understand how intelligent life could exist elsewhere.